What's happening, YouTube? Thanks for tuning in. Welcome back to the channel. In this video, guys, I wanted to talk a little bit about auto parts and how to actually buy auto parts. There could be quite a bit of confusion when it comes to buying auto parts because you can buy an OE part, an OEM part, an aftermarket part, and then you can hear terms such as a high quality aftermarket part and things like that. So what do you buy when you really need to purchase a replacement part for your vehicle? So first, let me explain the differences in OEM, OE, and aftermarket, because I think that if we establish what those mean, that'll set the tone for the rest of the video. So OE obviously is original equipment. That's going to be the part that actually was assembled on the vehicle in the assembly line at the factory. So that is the original equipment. So you might hear like OEM and you think, oh, OEM, that stands for original equipment manufacturer. So that must be the original part that came on the vehicle. That's not the original part. The OE part is the original part. The OEM is nothing more than an aftermarket part that has the approval of the automobile manufacturer. So whenever you buy an OEM part, that's probably going to be your better option in the aftermarket realm, if you will, because those parts are actually approved by the manufacturer, from an engineering standpoint, that they approve that product to be used as a replacement part. Aftermarket is basically just a knockoff, right? So a company will take a part, they'll look at it, and they'll try their best to mimic that part. You know, the same thread pitch, the same, hopefully the same material it was made from, but there's really no endorsement from the manufacturer of that part. So whenever buying an aftermarket part that's truly aftermarket, you run the risk of it not fitting well, it failing prematurely on you, or it not working right out of the box. Now, coming from someone who's ran an auto repair business for well over 10 years, I can tell you right off the bat, I learned how to purchase auto parts by trial and error. Because this is a topic that's really not discussed well enough in tech school. When I first got out of community college, the first guy who gave me a job, I actually developed some of his bad traits, if you will, or his misinformation to customers, because he would use terms like, don't worry, we'll get you a really good aftermarket part. And honestly, from what I know now, there's really no such thing as a high quality aftermarket part. An aftermarket part is basically a knockoff part. That would be saying like, I don't know, a fake pair of Nike shoes, and you tell your child, I'm gonna buy you a high quality pair of knockoff Nikes. Like there's no such thing, right? You either buy the pair of Nikes or you don't. So with parts, it's kind of like that. So I discourage aftermarket parts. Those are going to be your very cheap parts. I'm going to give you an example. I had a customer. Her name was Nova. God bless her. I had to change this woman's brakes literally every 3 months for probably 2 years. She would never learn. And she would say, Brian, why are you changing my brakes every 3 months? What's going on? And I would tell her, well, first of all, you're driving this Grand Am like it's a rally car for one. So you need to slow down, which she thought that was hilarious. But for two, I told her, Nova, you spending $15 on brake pads. What do you expect? She would get the cheapest brake pads possible. That came in a white box, no name, no brand. You don't even know who to contact if these brakes, failed. There's like no liability whatsoever, buy at your own risk kind of thing. And she would purchase these cheap $15 brake pads and have me install them every 3 months. I begged her to buy better quality brake pads, but she wouldn't. So that's like your aftermarket. There's no such thing really as a high quality aftermarket. Then when you get into the OEM, that's when you're getting into the more acceptable range. And these are the type of parts that most reputable auto mechanics are going to recommend, because the dealer or the OE parts are going to be, you know, up here in price, and you're going to have your aftermarket way down here. Let's say this part is $180 OE, you could get an aftermarket for like 65 bucks, and that middle OEM, you know, you could probably get that from somewhere around, let's say like, you know, 100 bucks even, you know. So that's going to be that middle tier is probably what most auto technicians are going to recommend their customers, because the automobile manufacturer has approved that particular part to go on that vehicle. That's what the OEM stands for. Okay, so you call up AutoZone, you put about, you know, 40,000 miles on a set of spark plugs. You want to do a tune-up on it. So you call AutoZone, you ask them how much for a set of spark plugs, you know, how much, or do you have them in stock? And what does the employee do? Immediately, well, he's training to upsell you. So what is he going to tell you? He's going to tell you, you need this high grade, double platinum, laser, diamond, iridium, unobtainium spark plug. That's what you need for your car. But that may not necessarily be the case. That may not be the OE material for that spark plug. These are like aftermarket parts now that he's trying to upsell you. Because, for example, I'll insert a clip. Okay, so now it's time to put in our new spark plugs. You want to make sure that you put in the correct spark plug, the OE plug. If you call up the parts store, 9 times out of 10, they're going to try to upsell you to some type of iridium plug or double platinum or whatever spark plug it is that they try to upsell you to. If your vehicle takes copper spark plugs or just a standard spark plug, do not let them tell you you need to put in a better quality spark plug, regardless of whatever pressure they put on you. That's just their job to try to sell. It's your job to make sure you install the correct spark plugs. Let me give you an example. So you can see here we replaced it with the correct spark plug, RC12MC-C4. You can see right here, it's the RC12MC-C4 spark plug. So you want to make sure you get the right spark plug in there. We'll take it a step further here. You can see on the spark plug installation instructions, it says caution in all capitals. The standard 4.7 liter V8 engine is equipped with copper core ground electrode spark plugs. They must be replaced with the same type number spark plug as the original. If another spark plug is substituted, pre-ignition will result. So you can see on that 4.7 Dodge, the OE material was just your basic standard copper spark plug. That's the OE spark plug. That's what should go in the vehicle. These other parts that's costing you more are aftermarket. Those aren't the OE. You really want to make sure that you find a OE or a OEM when you buy a spark plug. So you could ask who's ever at the parts counter, what's the original equipment in this vehicle? Don't just go with whatever they tell you. Find out, search online, Google it. What is the OE part? What came on this part when it rolled off the assembly line? So whenever I do auto repairs for customers, I'm an OE guy. I'm always going to recommend the OE. I'm never going to recommend a non-OE, or it's going to be an OEM part. Very rarely do I use a cheap aftermarket part. If a customer forces me to, I'll make them sign no warranty, we're not liable. Use this part at your own risk. because I really can't stand behind a lot of these aftermarket parts, because a lot of them come out the box barely working as is. Okay, let me pause for a second because I forgot to make this point while I was shooting this video, and this is probably one of the more important points. As auto technicians, or even someone working on their own vehicle, a DIYer, an advanced DIYer, anyone engaging in the repair of an automobile, this could be an issue for you. Buying cheap parts that will make you look terrible, especially for a professional technician. If you buy a cheap part, you can install that part beautifully and did everything correctly. And if that part fails immediately, or that oil pan starts leaking again, or that check engine light comes back on, or that car starts overheating again, it could really make you look like a novice, or you don't know what you're doing, and you could get that reputation, and this person ends up taking their car to someone else thinking that you're not a great mechanic, but you are. You just happen to buy a cheap part that, like I stated, barely worked out of the box. So this is something that you really got to be careful of if you are a professional technician. And one other point, if you're struggling and fighting with a part, you need to stop. The problem is not you, the problem is the part. You need to take that part back, go get an OE part or an OEM part that's a much better quality, and see how much easier it is to install that part. So don't waste a lot of time struggling trying to force a cheap part to fit. So when it comes to buying auto parts, it can be kind of tricky. Like I said earlier in the video, I learned through trial and error when it comes to buying auto parts. I've bought auto parts before that didn't work out of the box, that I've never bought again. I bought auto parts that failed on me, relatively soon, and I had to take them out and replace them. I'll give you a couple of examples. When it comes to buying head gaskets, I've bought cheaper head gaskets before, and upon first inspection, it looks pretty similar to the OE gasket. Well, this gasket, it looks like the same gasket, and you use it, and that gasket fails on you before your first oil change, or you may only get 3,000 miles out of it, and next thing you know, you start having blown head gasket symptoms again. I'll insert some footage here. We'll just let this dry. I'm ready to. So I got two gaskets laid out here. I got a genuine Mopar gasket, and I also have a gasket that came with the rebuild kit, which is D&J. So if you're doing this job, hopefully this information will help when selecting a gasket. So we want to look at our gasket thickness. According to the specs, our gasket needs to be no more than 0.7 millimeter compressed. So when you torque this down, the gasket shouldn't be below 0.7 millimeters or 0.7 millimeters. So that's the main purpose. You don't reuse a gasket, even though it's sheet metal, and it may still look intact, but usually if it's been clamped in between the head and the block for so long, it would definitely drop below that thickness. So anyway, I'm going to take my little digital caliper and let's see which one of these gaskets are thicker. So I'm going to start with the D&J, and I'm just going to find some point on a gasket to measure it at. See, we're at about 0.9 on this D&J gasket. Let's see what we got on the Mopar gasket. This one is at 0.9 as well. If we do a side-by-side comparison on these gaskets, we know that this Mopar is the OE gasket from Chrysler, and that this is a replica. So if we go through and take a closer look and see, since they are the same exact thickness and they will compress likely at the same thickness, is there any advantages to spending a little bit more on the genuine gasket? This is the factory gasket, so I know it's going to fit every hole perfectly, every oil and coolant passage. For example, this coolant passage right here, if you look at the hole, it's a lot bigger than this coolant passage on this aftermarket. So it's just little variations like that that it's wiser to go with a genuine head gasket. It's easy to overlook some of the differences on aftermarket stuff. So there's a lot of subtle differences when it comes to buying auto parts that you could overlook. But a trained professional or someone who's been doing this for a really long time and has struck out buying cheap parts, they'll tell you. I once had to pull a thermostat out that I just bought in the middle of Utah. I believe we were in Utah, coming back home from a trip to the Midwest, visiting some family members, and our car started to overheat, me and my wife. Before we had kids, it was just me and her, and our car started to overheat. And so, obviously I got out, popped the hood, we pulled over, and the radiator hose was super tight just before the thermostat. So I knew the thermostat wasn't opening up, so we let the car cool down, and I unbolted the thermostat housing, pulled that thermostat out, and gave it my best Tom Brady launch in some wide open field, and collected as much fluid as I can to put back in the system, just to get us to a gas station where I could top us off, and sealed it back up without the thermostat. We had to drive from Utah back to California with no thermostat. So yeah, and I had just put that thermostat in. I bought it from AutoZone before we left because I wanted to make sure we didn't have any overheating issues on our way back. So I thought, it'd be a good idea to put a fresh thermostat in there before we drive all the way back to California, since we are driving like 1,500 miles. And so anyway, I learned the hard way in a lot of cases, or just through trial and error when it comes to buying auto parts. So there are some times when, like I said, the OE has to be used, especially when it comes to electrical components. I really haven't had good success using the aftermarket, like mass airflow sensors or oxygen sensors. Some O2 sensors are okay if you get an OEM. A lot of NTK OEMs are really good, but then again, a lot of NTK and Bosch O2 sensors, some of those are actually OE, because these companies will actually get or purchase or contract with these companies that manufacture oxygen sensors that actually put them on a vehicle. So you can easily, get up under a Toyota and crack the O2 sensor loose and look on it and see that it says Denso on it. So that's another thing too. A lot of times the OE part for that vehicle might actually be a reputable OEM company. So that's why, again, I only really recommend OEM or OE. Buying cheap aftermarket is really not the way to go. All right, so in closing, how to buy auto parts. All right, so tip number one, know that OE is always going to be your better option. OEM is going to be your second best option. And aftermarket is always a knockoff, and there's really no such thing as a high quality aftermarket. So number two, when you do buy a part, do not be upsold by a salesperson at a parts store. Make sure you find out what your vehicle needs. Make sure you do your research ahead of time and tell them what you want. Don't let them tell you what you need. Tip number three, there are cases where the original equipment should be used. Typically for engine management systems, such as mass airflow sensors, I would say like some evap system stuff, like a charcoal canister or some vent solenoids and things like that. That stuff needs to be OE. as well as some internal parts, like maybe a head gasket or things like that. And in some cases, OE needs to be used. Thermostats, always you should go with the OE. I never buy aftermarket. And then a lot of times in fluids, fluids need to be the OE fluid and not to use other fluids. For example, Honda, a lot of time in Honda transmissions, you really need to use OE Honda transmission fluid. So I personally, when it comes to transmission fluids, I always use the OE transmission fluid and never really go aftermarket, depending on the vehicle. But with newer vehicles, especially if it has a CVT transmission in it, things like that, you're gonna wanna buy the OE fluids. So there are cases where you should not buy an OEM or an aftermarket and you have to buy the OE. All right, so I forgot what tip I was on, but the next tip, sometimes buying a used OE part is better than buying a new aftermarket part. I'm not talking about an OEM part. I'm talking about a straight, cheap aftermarket starter or alternator or something like that. A lot of times you may actually come out better going to the junkyard and actually pulling off like an OE part. Even though it's used, it's probably better than that aftermarket. So I thought I'd throw that out there as a tip because that's been my experience. All right, so my last tip for buying parts, if you really have to buy a cheap aftermarket part, you might be strapped for cash and you just need this part to get you by, do not leave that part in the car. That part could fail on you at the most inconvenient time. I would definitely take that part out once you are able to get a better quality part and put that better quality part in to save yourself the embarrassment or save yourself from missing an appointment or just leaving yourself stranded or something like that from using these knockoff unreliable aftermarket parts that are probably made in China and aren't really very good quality. All right, anyway, that's all I got for you guys today. This is Bryan916. Thanks for tuning in. See you on the next one.